I'm Melanie Cave, Managing Director at Roots, and today I'm joined by Chine McDonald, author and director of the think tank Theos. We're discussing her new book, Unmaking Mary. We talk about how the experience of motherhood profoundly changes us, what we can learn about God from the experience of motherhood, and how we reconcile that with the fact that many will not become mothers. We explore how the Virgin Mary is held up as an unhelpful ideal for women, whether consciously or not, as a docile, pure, and perhaps white version of motherhood that doesn't accurately represent the biblical accounts of her life. Is she a balance to overly masculine ideas about God? We touch on how we can be complicit with the oppressive ideas on women and mothers. And does this have the same roots as the cultural crisis around masculinity? We finished with a conversation about the Black Madonna and what that representation does for us. I hope you will enjoy it, and I'm sure you'll want to hear more from Chine. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
I wondered if we could just start off by you introducing yourself a little bit to some of the listeners who won't have heard of you. You work for a think tank called Theos, but you have a life much beyond that. So do you want to tell us just a bit about your background and how you came into that role?
Yes, I guess I'm a little bit of a busybody and have my fingers in many pies, but my main job, my day job, is as director of Theos, which is a religion and society think tank. Now, often when I introduce myself at parties, people ask, what do you mean by religion? What do you mean by society? And what is a think tank? So there's lots of explaining to do. But in effect, we are at our heart a research agency. And think tanks are research organisations that try to make a change in society in some way. And for Theos, when it was started 20 years ago, that change was around the public narratives around the inclusion of faith and people of faith within public life, so across culture, politics, media, the arts. And it was started at a point in history when people were really vocal, people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens, who are very vocal about the idea that religion was actually really bad for us. And if you're going to be religious, do it behind closed doors. Don't let it have anything to do with our public life. So we kind of started as an organization trying to change that. So to say that Christianity in particular is a really compelling vision for human flourishing, and that people of faith themselves can be good for society. And 20 years on, we're kind of navigating the changing place of religion in society, because actually, I would say currently it's much more welcome than it was in the years post 9/11. But now that we are much more accepted, have a seat at the table in many influential places, what exactly is it that we are wanting to say? It's not just about being there, it's about what is that vision. So we do research, we do events, podcasts, publications on a range of topics to do with human flourishing in society. So refugees, death, motherhood, science and religion, AI and relationships, social prescribing, the health service, you name it. We've probably done something similar, kind of related to it.
Yeah. Well, I've really, really enjoyed listening to your podcast. I listened to the Motherhood and the Machine. It's beautifully, beautifully done and very insightful and, moves you to tears many times because it's authentic stories that people are talking about, but also really important issues that don't have easy answers. And I think that's the thing most with all these issues that you're grappling with. They're not like, oh, tick, here's the Bible verse, just do this. They're not those kind of issues. They're tricky issues that impact lots of layers and issues and areas of society. So I do thank you for you and your team and all that you're doing and researching and crafting wisdom around these areas. I think it's really helpful.
Yeah.
So
I'm really grateful for the fantastic team, and I'm still pinching myself that I have this job because it is absolutely it's the thing I would do if I wasn't paid to be doing it.
What a gift, yeah. And how does somebody become, how do you get to work for a think tank? Is it just a room full of, think tank is a funny word, isn't it? You kind of imagine like a fish tank full of clever people. So, is it people who volunteer? Do people do internships? How does that work?
Oh gosh, we don't have any volunteers. We've got a team of about 20 people. Half of them are researchers, often from academic backgrounds, very clever people. And our kind of comms team and operations. How do people tend to get here? We do have an internship, actually, that we've been running for a few years. That is a kind of 9-month internship. And the graduates from there tend to have done a master's or even a PhD sometimes on theology, history, politics, kind of social sciences,
Yeah.
that world. The reason why I say it's my exact niche is because I studied theology at university, but then trained as a journalist and have kind of worked at the kind of, I guess, intersection of faith, Christianity, and the mainstream for most of my career. And
Mm.
it's the thing that I feel particularly called to. My sense of vocation is to communicate the Christian faith to a world that no longer understands it. And so I love doing that through some of the things I do, including Thought for the Day on Radio 4, Today programme, BBC Religion and Ethics, Moral Maze Sunday programme. I think religion and Christianity are relevant to absolutely everything, which is why it's also exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. And we need voices like yours. So that's been, I love it when I hear you. So, and just bringing a different perspective, a diverse, very wise perspective, I think. But so that's one of the things I really enjoyed about Unmaking Mary is that that's your new book that is recently come out and it's all about motherhood, which we'll get into in a minute. But I really liked that, particularly because Roots comes from like an ecumenical perspective. We've got people from all flavors of the church who subscribe to us and listen, and that you're coming from quite a broad perspective of like looking at faith and from different countries, different traditions. So obviously looking at the Virgin Mary and this idea of like, is Mary our ideal of motherhood? Perhaps from a Protestant tradition, I didn't grow up. I mean, obviously, Mary is featured highly in the Nativity and a few times in the Gospels, but she's not a character that I heard hundreds and hundreds of sermons about. It was always Jesus focused. And so when I picked up the book, I thought, oh, do I have Mary as an example of femininity for me or of motherhood? Do I? And then I thought, I think you're right that she's sort of in the subconscious sort of cultural narrative, but not overt in my church tradition. But I obviously would see that in the Catholic tradition, but I think it is more present than I was aware of. And so after reading it, I'm now noticing it in places I didn't see before. So I suppose we should backtrack a little bit. So you've written books before, but what brought you to this Unmaking Mary book on motherhood?
Yeah, they always say write what you know. And I guess I wouldn't have written this book without the previous book I wrote, which was God is Not a White Man, thinking about the images that are held up as the ideals in our society. So God is Not a White Man is about basically the white cultural narratives around God and Jesus, and the effects of that. But when it came to writing another book, as in the publishers were like, oh, what do you want to write next? I was on my second maternity leave and there was nothing else I could think about apart from my baby and being a mother. I became fascinated by it, obviously tired by it. My baby was the center of my life. So I couldn't think beyond that. And I thought that was interesting. I realized I'd not read much from a Christian perspective or a theological perspective about motherhood that went beyond the what God says about what it is to be a good wife or woman or mother. And I tended to think about those books as kind of pink and the flowers on them. I really wanted to write a gritty, earthy, realistic story narrative about the reality of motherhood versus these very idealized perceptions that we have. And I wanted to write about that. I had at the same time been reading lots of secular books around the subject because there are loads and loads of them, especially post-COVID. A lot of people are writing about the maternal experience and the reality, warts and all of it. So I wanted to kind of enter that conversation from a Christian and theological perspective.
And I think motherhood is one of those things where you're right, it becomes this all-consuming thing. It's the physicality of it, it's the sleeplessness, it's being surrounded by your children. But it's also that feeling of like you end up being with other mothers just by nature of being on the school run or being in toddler groups and you're surrounded by other women and we tend to compare ourselves. I don't know if that's a learned habit or if that's just human nature, but we do tend to compare and often end up feeling awful is the general shortcome. And reading your book, there's so much authenticity and vulnerability, which I commend because, it's hard to talk about these things. It's very personal. And you think my children think when they read this later. And we're told to, guard these things or keep them private. The other day on the train, I was reading the bit in German, the Raven Mother. I don't know how to say it in German.
Rabenmutter.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that idea that, a woman who goes back to work is leaving the nest too soon and neglecting her children. But the fact that was then used to describe a woman who didn't even have any children.
Angela Merkel.
Yes. And then a woman who had 7 children, who obviously loves having children. You don't have 7 kids if you don't love being a mother. So how could this word be attached to both of these women who are working? And that sense of like, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. That sense of motherhood is this impossible task that however good you are with your kids, they're going to make choices, they're going to make their own decisions, and they're going to probably break your heart at some point. They're going to get hurt. You can't protect them from everything. But the moment something goes wrong, you feel guilty or society blames you. Whatever you do, you're getting it wrong. And how do we as Christian women find role models that work, and that the one that is held up in scripture is the Virgin Mary, but she's not, I don't know, she's not very universal. Doesn't look like she works, or we can't compare her work life to the way that we work now in the West. We just hear very little about her actual mothering, about her other children. So why do you think she is held up as this paragon of virtue? Why her? Why not somebody else in the Bible, I guess?
Yeah, this is so much to say here. So one of the things I noticed when I was reading these secular books about motherhood was that at some point in these secular books, they would mention Mary. So they would mention Mary as this ideal, that they would talk about Mary at these kind of art galleries and this kind of public consciousness. And I, director of a religion think tank, I found that really interesting because I'm constantly trying to find connection points. So these secular writers were already connecting themselves to this Christian person, or this Christian idea.
Yeah.
Why her? I think because there aren't many verses about women in the Bible at all. So there are relatively, quite a few about her. She is the mother of God, the mother of Jesus. And there have been lots of theological thinking about her, particularly in the Catholic Church, and what she represents, what she says, what her existence says about the nature of our relationship with God, our relationship with Jesus. Is it through her? What role does she play? Is she like God, or is she not? Is she human? All of these things. I think that there's a lot of material relatively to work with in the stories that we have about Mary in the Bible. But I would say, though, that I do find, because I'm also from a Protestant evangelical tradition, I really did not pay attention to her at all. The only times I heard about her were at Christmas, and the only time in church.
Yeah.
And the only things that I was told about her was that she said yes. She consented. She was a kind of good little woman. She did as she was told. Pretty much the only story. I actually think in scripture itself, there are clues that I hadn't noticed before that actually I find very relatable. So yes, there isn't much kind of obvious description about her being a mother. But one of my favorite stories now is where Jesus goes missing after 3 days, and when they can leave Jerusalem, they first of all, that panic that every mother has felt, which is, hang on a minute, where have they got? I've finally done it. I've lost him.
Yeah.
Where on earth? What have I done? And then that scramble to find him.
Yeah.
And then the cheekiness of the response almost. Didn't you know where I would be? Didn't you know I'd be in my father's house? And where she says to him, didn't you know that we'd be worried about you? We've been really anxious about you. Yeah. And that is in scripture. But there has been lots of trying to explain that away in the kind of theology, where in Catholic tradition, because of this idea that Mary is sinless, that anxiety is seen as a sin. So therefore she must not have
maternal
been
worry
anxious.
is a sin? Goodness, we're all going to
exactly. So I hold on to that worry, because that is a big part of my maternal experience, worrying about my kids.
Yes. Yeah. So there is, I really like the bit about Mary's Magnificat, her like almost justice piece when she sings praise to God and she talks about nations being brought low, and what Jesus is, the sort of almost political, it sounds like, revolution that she's prophesying about Jesus. But not much is made of that. And it's almost like Mary and Hannah and all these women do actually sort of prophesy and make these grand preachy kind of gestures, but that's not how they're remembered. We see them holding a baby. We see them as docile. And it feels to me that this, and I think you pick up on this in the book, that it feels like Mary is used as this sort of archetype to tell women from a men's perspective, like how you should behave. This is what the ideal woman looks like. She's docile. She says yes. She stays at home. She looks after the children. And I guess I'm wondering, like, was that a conscious effort to use Mary in that way? Can we show that from the historical documents? Or is it just kind of a default that that's just how it's happened and it wasn't purposeful?
The Magnificat.
Well, no, this idea of like that bit of Mary's personality is not elevated to the same level as her sort of just motherhood, quiet motherhood, I would say, her peaceful motherhood.
Yeah, because if you think about it, the fact that it is in scripture
Mm.
and Hannah's song is so
Mm.
powerful. It's such a powerful demonstration of how God sees women and how
Yeah.
God includes women in this story. But I think we have deliberately, the patriarchy over many centuries, has deliberately dialed up her prettiness rather than her prophetic nature.
Yeah.
But one of the things I found really fascinating in kind of researching the book was learning about the early depictions, pictures of the early church, some of the oldest artifacts that we have, some of which depict Mary with her arms up, like as a prophet, as a leader
Yeah.
within the Jesus movement in those early years. She was very much a part of that. She was very much a part of, alongside the disciples, being part of that community in those earliest days. She also, it's kind of ironic and almost ridiculous that she's been reduced to this kind of very docile, passive woman when, yes, she was extremely strong. She watched her son die on a cross. She continued to be part of this predominantly male movement, kind of spreading the gospel. She did say yes to God, in the kind of strong way rather than a passive way. I would say, and she is so much more interesting to me now than before. Also, one of the things I love is that Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, talks about how actually Mary was Jesus's first teacher. So who would have taught him how to read the scriptures in Hebrew? Who would have kind of taught him about what it is to be a human, about, how to live in the world? It was probably his mother, because Joseph would have been much more passive, I guess, in the background, and it's thought that he might have died earlier on. So who's the kind of physical presence in his life? And that's really like powerful as well. So much of it's not just that mothers feed babies and cuddle them and dress them. There's also so much intellectual thought, so much mind forming and formation that happens in the kind of motherhood journey, that we kind of dial down and don't talk about enough.
Yeah. And I think so much of motherhood is manners and kindness and empathy, and a lot of that sort of mirroring back to a child that's going to hurt somebody's feelings. How are we going to manage this? Resilience, all of that kind of coaching happens very naturally in relationship, often mother and child. And I'm not saying fathers can't do that, they often do. But there is a lot of that going on. And you think, Jesus's kindness, the way he interacts with people, I would have thought he would learn that from Mary. I mean, we like to think Jesus had this sort of like character of God imprinted on him and that there was no other human imprint. But I think Mary, surely God chose her for a reason, didn't he? And maybe it's because he loved her character and thought she would imprint that on her son.
Yeah, because imagine if she had been a negative force in his life, if she hadn't had that character, that would have influenced him, or he would have left and to be God alone.
Yeah, but he was very much in community, so she'd obviously modeled something. No, that's really helpful. So one of the things you talk about in the book is around Mary being like an opportunity for us to see the female aspects of God, and whether that is sometimes in the Catholic tradition, there can be this idea of Mary, Queen of Heaven, this idea of her almost having God-like status, but not. Particularly in this world, and based on your previous book, this idea that there's a lot of maleness and whiteness put onto what we see as God and probably onto what we see as Jesus. What do we get from Mary in a good way that we can learn about?
Yeah, I think what we can learn about God through Mary is the character and nature of God, in that God chooses a woman to be God's first home. God could have just appeared.
Yeah.
God didn't have to be in a womb for 9
Yeah.
months and then be born. So I think that tells me something about the personhood of God, the things that God sees as important.
Mm.
And that includes the body. And rather than kind of dismiss the kind of bodily aspects of what it is to be human, God works through that and in that, the humility of God to be born as a baby of a woman, of a young woman. So it's more those aspects that tell me about who God is. Where I find it potentially problematic, this idea that Mary almost reflects the kind of feminine aspects of God, is that God is not a man. So it's almost like sometimes people can fall into the trap of thinking, well, God is a man, so he needed this kind of female sidekick to show his fluffy side.
Yeah.
That's
It's kind of like a yin and
this,
yang, like split God down the
yeah.
middle, and as if that's what God needs, but he doesn't.
Yeah. So, and Mary is not divine. Mary is not God. Mary is a woman.
Yeah.
So actually I think Mary kind of filling this womanly aspect bit of God, I think is problematic. And also the idea that we might almost, that there's this perception in our people's heads that God is this angry man and that we need a nice lady to ask. Can ask
On my
her?
behalf.
Can you ask God to?
Yeah.
to-
So what you're saying is like it's poor theology of God
Yeah.
that makes us need Mary to be divine because
Yes.
we have God in this box that is not helpful, and therefore we need a fuller picture. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to elevate Mary. Whereas if we have a bigger, more full picture of God and see not his maleness, but his goodness, his care, all of that, then Mary can be human, and that's actually more powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then people often ask me, so I don't use male pronouns for God anymore since writing my last book, even when it's awkward. It makes it awkward in a sentence. As a writer, that's really painful. But I kind of try to describe God as God. People often say, well, Jesus refers to God as Father, so therefore God is male or God is a father. And I think, yes, Jesus does describe God as Father, but first of all, there's a book by Amy Peeler called Women and the Gender of God, in which she says, obviously Jesus called God Father because Jesus already had a mother. So that's a very simple explanation. But also there are lots of other passages of scripture in which God is described in female ways. And so if we're going to say, well, Jesus says this, well, we also have got to take into account the other places in which God is not described as male either. And I think people shouldn't be worried about that or anxious about it. I think if we are, maybe it tells us something about what we really think about who God is. Actually, what we should lead us to a much more expansive, interesting understanding of who God is. For me, it makes God bigger in my mind rather than smaller.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. So we get this idea that's sort of in, as you say, it's in art, it's in society, that Mary is this ideal for motherhood and very much an unattainable ideal, potentially crafted purposefully or not purposefully, I don't know, by the patriarchy to keep us women in line. But I think your book is a step towards this, but how do we as the church support women and mothers to not come under this very oppressive ideal, which, you outline in the book quite well, we are doing our best, but we feel awful. We feel guilty all the time that we're not doing it well enough because this ideal is this perfect, sinless Virgin Mary who never seems to get it wrong except losing Jesus at the temple. But maybe that wasn't a sin. But it's like this ideal is so high, and the societal pressure and the pressure that I think we as women put on ourselves to meet these unattainable. We've somehow been complicit with this. I think we agree with it to some degree. But what can we do in the church to sort of, I guess, take Mary off the pedestal to help women actually live it authentically in the grace of God rather than under this pressure?
I think that's the word, grace. And that's what I came to when I was writing that section of the book, which is all about these kind of perfect ideals. I thought, well, in part of the point of the Christian story is grace. So for anyone who feels like they don't meet a particular standard in a particular thing, or even in this idea of perfection in general, that there is grace for us in that. And that's not because of us. That's because of Jesus.
Yeah.
That's because of Christ. So we should exhale in that. For mothers, I just feel like there are exacerbated ways in which we can point to that kind of the ways in which we are constantly seeming like we have failed. I think that's true of all women, because whether you've had children or not, you're failing at being a woman. If you've not had children, then obviously you're failing in the society's eyes. If you've had children, then maybe you're failing because you're not looking after them. Maybe you're going to work, or maybe you're not going to work, whatever it is. So there's all sorts of ways in which we're led to compete with each other. So I think it feels easy to say and can maybe glib, but it is that recognition that actually we're not perfect and we are not going to meet this standard. So there's actually no point trying and striving to be perfect. What we all need to do is rest in this grace that we've been given, this gift that we can exhale and rest in the knowledge of who we are because we're people made in the image of God. I think that one of the fascinating things I kind of came to realize is that, yes, Mary is one way in which there is this ideal placed upon women, but that's replicated in so many different ways in our cultures. I think when I was growing up, or in the 80s, the perfect ideals were celebrities on the fronts of magazines, people who looked perfect. Now I think it's something different, which is it's ourselves on social media and the ways in which we perpetuate this kind of ideal standard, the images that we share. So I very much know that I obviously wouldn't post pictures of my messy house on Instagram. When I'm taking pictures of my cute children, they've probably annoyed me a few minutes before, or I'm kind of saying, don't stand in front of that mess. Like, we've got to stand in front of the tidy bit. So we also play into this, and we also kind of make each other feel bad.
Yeah.
It's a bit more honesty and a bit more humanity and truth sharing about the realities, I think is helpful for all of us, because all of us think that no one else is failing, that we're the only ones. So why don't we just all share?
And so, like, the current backdrop culturally is that there's lots of conversation about masculinity, about boys failing, about us not doing enough for young men, about, the crisis of male suicide. There's a lot of conversation around that. And I feel like you can almost turn in any different direction and somebody can say, well, these people are failing, or we're not doing enough for them. These people mothers are under pressure. Is this just universal? Or how does this conversation about motherhood fit into this conversation about masculinity? Are they separate or are they interlinked? Or is this just a cultural, like, there's just too much pressure on everybody, this isn't working?
I would say the latter. I think there's too much pressure on everybody. I think that in putting forward these ideals about what it is to be a mother and a woman, we're also, in the same breath, without necessarily naming it, we're saying, so men are something else. So these ideas about a mother being nurturing, beautiful, kind of a homemaker, it implies that men are not nurturing, or that there are kind of something else entirely. I don't think anyone should be in any box, because we are individual people created in the image of God. Men could be nurturing, soft, kind. Fathers can be all of those things. We should allow them to be that. When I think about my husband cuddling my babies or my children, this idea that men can't be that is so obviously ridiculous. I, as a mother, and many mothers I know, can be fierce. They can be fiercely protective. They can be strong. They can do really hard things. So everyone knows in their kind of daily life that these boxes are just not enough to contain the variety of humanity and the kind of breadth of human experience. So I think for men, we should not put men or boys into any boxes that squeeze out the emotion, the vulnerability, the pain, and the loneliness, or kind of even speaking about those things. I think that's part of why we are in the situation that we're in. Just as women have been put in boxes and these ideals placed upon us, so have men and boys, and these assumptions about who they should be. I'm very conscious of this because I've got two boys. And I mean, everyone should be conscious of this, but I notice it even in my 3-year-old has started saying things like, oh, boys are good at, and I say, what do you mean boys? What do you mean boys are good at this? I said, everyone's good at that, or girls are good at that too. And that's 3 years old. I don't know where he's got that from. I know where he's got it from. He's got it from nursery, but these boxes start so early. So how can we help children to just be who they are.
And is it like a developmental thing? I think there's a whole thing where we like to polarize things. We like to make a dichotomy. This, I'm a boy, you're a girl. Da 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 da. There's a whole phase of development where it's almost like we spend time categorizing. Some of us don't ever seem to grow out of that phase. But then you kind of, after that structure is built, then you can deconstruct it and recognize nuance. So sometimes I think, well, this is just the way that our brains develop. We sort of start identifying these things. But I think where it is very difficult is when we're adults in the world and we know those boxes don't work, but we perpetuate them. And I still think we want to hold on to those boxes a little bit because they make us feel safe. And there's something about wanting to know that people are like us, like who's in my box, who's in my sphere, who gets me, who will understand me. So I can understand the desire for it, but equally it doesn't work. So, but as a society, we seem incapable of, if you throw away all the boundaries, that doesn't work either.
True.
So yeah, I feel puzzled in this sort of mess of it, of like, I think there are boundaries, there are lines between things. There is an experience that is motherhood. And it's not the same for everybody, but I think there is stuff to talk about that does, and you feel known and seen when somebody talks about it. Like I read it and I went, I resonate with that. That's my experience. Yes, Chine. Yes, I see you, And so there is something about being seen and known when somebody expresses these truths while still not wanting to like hold people too tight. And I worry that as churches, we want to give people guidelines and we want to direct them in good ways to go. And I don't want us to throw away guidelines and boundaries, but equally I don't want to put people in boxes.
Yeah, that's a really good articulation, because I think there's also, for me, I talk a lot and think a lot about nature versus nurture, on gender, and what is me and what is the culture in which I've grown up in. But there was something very clear to me when I had children, almost said, I feel this in my body. I feel that there are things that I have to do, can do, must do, that my husband can't and shouldn't. And that is really difficult to kind of say. It's probably my least progressive.
Yeah. Well, like when they cry, it viscerally does something in your body.
Yeah.
Your child's cry does something that somebody else's child crying doesn't do. And you're like,
and
that's
I can't
crazy.
sleep through
it. And other people can. Yes. And you think, what is that? Like, what has God done there in us that, and on one level, I'm very grateful because there's a deep connection that means I parent better. But it's hard because I want to say, but my husband can do this too,
Yeah. And then there is, to some extent, I think things do need to be more equal in this day and age, but it's really hard to do that. I'd say that feminism, I'm a feminist, feminism has done great wonders for women in the workplace. But what it hasn't done is got rid of the other stuff that is at home.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the reasons why I and many women are tired, because we're trying to be all of the things. So I'm trying to run an organization and be the boss, but I'm also constantly thinking about, has everyone got a cup of tea? Should I also just get these napkins for this particular event? I'm thinking about the house and what's for dinner and tidying up and washing up, and all of this mental load of motherhood that does not disappear when you also work full time. It's a bit more equaling on the kind of the practical side of things. My husband and I shared parental leave both times, and he's still one of the only a few people that I know who have done that. I think it was really good for me and for our children when I went back to work, for me to be leaving them with their dad. And like that helped me go back to work. But also he was in charge of the babies. So I think there's lots that can change, but I absolutely do know that there are some things that I feel differently about than my husband does.
And the matrescence stuff, I've forgotten the author now.
Lucy Jones.
Yes. So her thing about how motherhood does change you. Like, and it's very hard to put your finger on it, but there's something significant. And I think it is that sort of going from quite a self-centered world, even if you care about other people, ultimately you're responsible for yourself, to be fully immersed in carrying a child in your body and then caring for them. I think that sort of, it's like, you were orbiting the sun and now you're orbiting a different planet. And it feels like a huge jarring change. And I don't think a father feels it quite the same way. I think he would notice his partner, his wife's orbit changing, and that feels big, but I don't think their orbit changes in quite the same way. And so I think that has an identity impact. It has all sorts of things about how you see yourself, what you do with your time, even just where your thoughts go, as you're talking about the mental load. And so I think there is, and I love that the fact that you brought out sort of this idea of there being something of Jesus, that self-sacrifice, the dying, there's something of my body broken for you in the communion, that there's something that resonates for a mother in that is different, that you go, oh yeah, I understand that sort of laying my life down, sacrifice, feels like I'm dying quite regularly. I think there is something for women and women theologians and women Christians to share with men and say, I resonate with this. This is a very real embodied experience for me. But that doesn't mean that they haven't got experiences of God
No.
that are equally valid and good, so it's just saying it's unique to me.
Yeah, because one of the very difficult things I found in kind of trying to communicate all I did in the book was trying to say that this profound thing happened to me when I became a mother. It's like it's like nothing I've ever felt before. It's love like I've never known. But yet there are people who will not experience that, who maybe they desperately want to and they can't. Maybe they don't want to and they won't. But this assumption that, everyone needs to feel this. What I've tried to settle on is actually there are so many ways in which people can be profoundly altered in terms of their orbit. But for me, my profound altering was becoming a mother.
Mm.
And there are other ways in which that can happen.
Mm.
Yeah, I also think it's really hard for me to say, basically, I'm obsessed with my children in a way that my husband isn't. Obviously, he loves them. So we just really need to be careful in the kind of stories that we're putting out there. And also recognizing the pain that some people are carrying in the church, including in the church.
Yes.
Like that.
I'm aware that like Mother's Day and Father's Day in the churches I've been part of, we've danced around that subject of really wanting to honor the sacrifice and uniqueness that is motherhood or fatherhood, but also really aware that for a lot of people this is difficult. And sometimes I think we don't do well enough on either side. We're so desperately hard, trying to honor these people that we neglect the people who that is an area of pain, or we're so sensitive to those that this is an area of pain that we don't honor people. And I don't have a perfect solution to that. I wish I did, but it is that feeling of like, I see both sides of this, and how do we walk with people who are rejoicing when we are not? And how do we grieve with those who are grieving when we're privately celebrating? That is one of the challenges of church and community.
It is really, really hard. And I think if you're thinking about it, then you're doing better than many churches that kind of just kind of go out on this kind of celebration of motherhood and the sacrifice. And I remember a colleague, when I was writing the book, she did really help me see that actually there are so many things in the maternal experience that reflect the nature of God. This idea that you would be so tired, so utterly exhausted, like you couldn't describe, and then your baby cries and you've just got to get up and you've got to and you love them and you kind of cuddle them. Still, I'm always surprised about how much that feeling rise up. That is the love that God has for us.
Never gets tired, love.
Never gets tired. So how do you demonstrate that while people just desperately want that? So I think what we need to do in all of these things is tell the truth. Tell the truth about how we're feeling, whether we are rejoicing or not, and recognizing the pain or the joy of those who are in our church communities.
I want to finish with one of the chapters in the book. You talk about the Black Madonna. So this painting of obviously Mary as black, and recognizing that quite often some of the ideas that are associated with Mary are, as you say, beauty, purity, sinlessness, and whiteness. And I wondered if you could just unpack like what it was like for you doing the research around the Black Madonna. I know you did some stuff for the BBC on a recording about that. What did you learn from that experience?
Yeah, I think, as you say, wrapped up in some of the depictions and these ideal depictions of Mary are the fact that she's most often pictured as white. I think most people, if you imagine Mary, would imagine her wearing blue, white skin, rosy cheeks, blue eyes probably, and light hair. And she obviously didn't look like that. So that is that's a deliberate attempt to make her look like something else. And I guess when I think about a perfect mother in my own mind, I don't picture myself. I picture a white woman, probably Mary. And that's just the image that is in my head.
Yeah.
So it would never come, the first thing that came to my mind would not be a Black woman. Even though, you know, I was raised by an amazing Black woman. My aunties are Black women, you know, Black motherhood is what I was raised by. So what I was really amazed to discover was that there are some alternative depictions of Mary. Now, there are hundreds of these around the world. So their Black Madonnas are either paintings or images or sculptures or icons of Mary depicted with black skin. And there's been lots of discussion about whether that is deliberate, whether it's deliberately to display Mary as Afro-Caribbean, or whether it just happens to be black wood that's been darkened, or, you know, all that kind of stuff. And I'd say, regardless of why, I think for me, coming face to face with the first Black Madonna that I had seen in person, which was in Paris, it was a real profound moment for me. Not because I was worshipping that Black Madonna, but I'd never been into a place in which a church building in which the centerpiece could have been me or my aunties.
Yeah.
Like her features looked like people from my family. Now, it shouldn't really matter, but I realized viscerally that maybe it did matter.
Yeah.
Maybe it does
matter.
matter.
I can feel that, you know, like, oh, yeah.
Yeah, maybe it does matter. And the fact that Black Madonnas have also come to represent not just Black women, but all marginalized people around the world. So she's often the icon of the kind of liberation movement. So I've been just fascinated to see how Black Madonnas are revered in different places, particularly in Europe. I went to see another Black Madonna for this BBC documentary that was in Orléans, which is just outside Paris. And it was in this kind of big church. It was the church that it was the Black Madonna that Joan of Arc prayed to for victory. And so these are kind of ancient, like, you know, centuries old Black Madonnas. And we were in that church for about an hour. And every now and then, I think it was like Monday morning, every now and then the door would open and someone would come in and make their way to Black Madonna, take their shoes off, lay at her feet and pray. And what I was struck by was that pretty much all the people that I saw come in were Black women in France, you know, in just outside Paris, and that I hadn't seen any Black women on the train or in the walk up to it. But these people had congregated towards this because there they felt welcome or seen. So I found that a really beautiful experience.
And I think it kind of comes back to that where we started, that, you know, God isn't a white man, and so if our picture of God, and the idea that we even have a picture of God, because he
Yeah.
But we do, don't we? But if that picture, he feels male, then we default to finding a Virgin Mary to be the female side. If he feels white, then we need something that feels black and brown, more reflective of who we are. And can our picture of God actually get more true, so that we don't need all these alternate versions? Or maybe we just layer them so that we see more of the multifacetedness of God. Because I think, yeah, it's almost like through all these different lenses we see different pieces of who God is. Yeah, no, that's really beautiful. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for talking to us. And I just want to encourage people to get hold of the book. It's called Unmaking Mary, and fascinating study. And it's kind of memoir, theology, it's all sorts of stuff in one. But I really enjoyed it. So thank you for writing that and talking about this important subject.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
Chine has written an article for Roots supporting our weekly Bible notes and preaching resources, which you can find on our website. She's also previously guest edited an issue of Roots. There are links to her article in the show notes. And her book, Unmaking Mary, is available from Hodder and Stoughton. The think tank Theos has a podcast series on a similar topic called Motherhood and the Machine. I recommend you check it out. To find out more about Roots resources that help you lead great church, head to rootsforchurches.com and take out a free trial. You can find all our articles, weekly and seasonal resources, sermon starters, prayers, children and youth resources, plus our 25-year archive online. There is so much that will help you in your leadership. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share with leaders in your church and network, and leave us a review, as that helps others find it. Together, we can grow.